Major Parker, remove that medal before this court continues. The words landed like a slap across a silent courtroom. I looked down at the Navy cross pinned above my heart, the one piece of metal that had never once left my side in 20 years of service, and I felt every eye in that room waiting to see if I would break. Across the aisle, Ethan sat with his hands folded, the corner of his mouth, curling into something he thought looked like victory. He believed I was about to lose the last thing that made me untouchable. He had no idea that 3 minutes earlier, the court clerk had stamped an envelope that was going to end everything he'd built. I unpinned the medal with steady fingers and set it on the table in front of me, and I didn't say a word. Not yet. 3 years earlier, none of this had seemed possible. I came home from my final deployment to a house full of balloons and a husband who couldn't stop telling our guests how much he'd sacrificed to hold our family together while I was gone. I remember standing in my own kitchen, still adjusting to carpet under my boots instead of sand, and thinking that gratitude sounded strange coming out of Ethan's mouth. It sounded rehearsed, but I told myself he was just a man who'd spent too many nights alone worried doing his best. I gave him that grace because that's what 20 years of marriage teaches you to do. You give the benefit of the doubt until the evidence stops allowing it. The evidence started slow. A joke here, a comment there. He began referring to my career as a government job with a nice uniform, usually in front of people we both knew, always with that same easy laugh that made it sound harmless. I let it go. I told myself Marines learn to absorb worse than words. I was getting close to retirement, and for the first time in 2 decades, I let myself imagine an ordinary life, the kind where I woke up in the same house every morning, where I used my savings to open a support center for military families navigating divorce deployment trauma, the invisible wreckage nobody talks about at homecoming parades. I'd been carrying that idea quietly for years. I finally said it out loud to Ethan one night over dinner, and he nodded like he was listening. And 2 weeks later, he asked me to sign a stack of paperwork for the company, something about restructuring for tax purposes. I didn't sign right away. I wanted Marcus, my attorney friend from my JAG days, to look it over first. Ethan's jaw tightened when I told him that, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. Around the same time, the dinners started. Working dinners, he called them, always with Serena Cole, his company's CFO, always running late, always followed by a distracted kind of silence when he came home. I'd spent my career reading rooms full of men trying to hide fear behind bravado. I knew what a lie looked like even when it was dressed up as overtime. One night, lying in the dark, Ethan said something I've never been able to forget. When you finally retire, this family won't have to live in the military's shadow anymore. I lay there a long moment before I understood what he actually meant. It was never about the uniform. It was never about deployments or long absences, or the parts of me the war had quietly rearranged. Ethan couldn't stand that I didn't need him. My paycheck, my rank, my discipline, none of it depended on his approval, and somewhere along the way that had become unbearable to him. A man who needs to be needed will eventually resent a woman who doesn't need saving. I should have said something that night. I told myself I would once I understood the shape of what I was dealing with. I found out sooner than I expected. I came home early one afternoon, my truck still smelling like the training range, and I found Ethan and Serena at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, bent over a property appraisal. My house, the one my father left me, the one I'd bought with the last thing he ever gave me, sat open between them like a business proposal. Serena's laptop was angled toward Ethan's spreadsheets, glowing on the screen numbers I didn't recognize attached to a house I'd lived in for 11 years. Neither of them heard me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching my husband circle a line on the appraisal with a yellow highlighter, watching Serena nod along like they were closing a deal instead of dismantling a marriage. I stepped closer before either of them looked up, and my eyes landed on the highlighted sentence at the bottom of the page. Ownership transfer to be finalized following divorce ruling. Ethan's head snapped up. For half a second, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, not quite. Calculation. Like he was already deciding what version of the truth he'd give me. I didn't ask him to explain. I already understood exactly what I was looking at. Ethan denied everything, of course. When I finally asked him directly about Serena, about the appraisal, about the highlighted line that read like a sentence already passed, He looked at me with the calm patience of a man who'd rehearsed his innocence in the mirror. "You're reading into things," he said. "You've been under a lot of stress." It was the first time he used my own service against me like a weapon, and it wouldn't be the last. 4 days later, before I'd even decided how to move forward, Ethan filed for divorce first. I remember sitting in Marcus Reed's office reading through the petition, feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. In his filing, Ethan claimed I was emotionally distant and frequently absent. He claimed I showed signs of severe PTSD. He claimed I kept weapons in the house in a manner that endangered our daughter. He claimed I was unfit to provide Emily with a stable home. He wanted primary custody. He wanted exclusive use of the house. He wanted a portion of my military pension. He wanted control of our joint investment accounts. And buried near the end, almost as an afterthought, he'd requested a temporary restraining order, barring me from the property citing safety concerns. Marcus set the papers down slowly. "This isn't a man reacting to a broken marriage," he said. "This is a man executing a plan." He was right, and I knew it the moment I understood the timeline. Serena had been moving money out of joint company accounts for months, routing it through what looked like legitimate business transfers. Ethan had taken every sleepless night I'd ever had after deployment, every quiet moment of guilt I'd carried for the men who didn't come home, and built a case file out of my grief. Emily started avoiding my eyes around the house. She'd flinch slightly when I raised my voice, even gently, even in normal conversation. I didn't understand why until Marcus told me what Ethan had apparently been telling her, that I could break, without warning that her mother wasn't as steady as she seemed. I hired Marcus that week. He was a former JAG attorney, unshowy, deliberate, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. "He doesn't just want to win the divorce," Marcus told me during our first real strategy session. "He wants to turn your entire career into evidence against you." Marcus also discovered something else. The case had been assigned to Judge Raymond Halpern, a man who regularly appeared at fundraising events Ethan's company sponsored. It wasn't proof of anything. Judges attend 100 events a year. But it was the kind of detail that made the back of my neck prickle, the kind of thing you file away and watch. At the first hearing, Halpern interrupted me 3 times before I finished a sentence. He nodded sympathetically every time Ethan's attorney spoke. By the end of the session, he'd granted Ethan temporary use of the house, and I found myself packing a duffel bag in the same efficient, joyless motion I used to pack for deployment. Except this time, I was leaving my own home. I moved into a small apartment near the base. Boxes stacked against a wall I didn't choose in a kitchen I didn't know yet, and somewhere across town, Ethan was sleeping in my father's house. He caught me in the courthouse hallway on my way out that day. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You've been living off your reputation for a long time," he said, voice almost gentle, like he was doing me a kindness by saying it. "In that courtroom, nobody cares who you used to be." I didn't answer him. I'd learned a long time ago that men like Ethan mistake silence for surrender. It's never that. It's just patience with a longer fuse than they can imagine. That night, Marcus called with something new, an anonymous email forwarded from an account that traced back to nothing conclusive, showing that the judge's clerical assistant had sent Ethan's attorney an unpublished hearing schedule days in advance. It wasn't a smoking gun, it wasn't verified, it was a thread thin and unproven, but a thread all the same. "We can't use this yet," Marcus said. "If we bring an unverified email into that courtroom, Halpern will bury us for it." I sat in my new apartment that night, surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked, looking at a photo of Emily from before all of this. Before the accusations, before the appraisal, before a judge who already seemed to have made up his mind. I thought about every ambush I'd trained men to survive, every lesson about patience under fire, about not returning shots until you had a clean line. This wasn't a firefight, but it was starting to feel like one. I closed my laptop and told Marcus we'd wait. Whatever Ethan and Halpern were building, I wanted to see the whole shape of it before I moved. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them certain. Certain men make mistakes. I'd learned that a long time ago in places far more dangerous than a family courtroom, and I intended to use it now. The rumors started quietly, the way they always do. A comment here, a knowing glance there, until one morning a post appeared on the neighborhood social page, describing me as An officer who can't tell the battlefield from her own family. Nobody used my name. Nobody had to. Everyone in that town knew exactly who they meant. I found out about it from a neighbor who thought I deserved a heads up before I saw it myself. I remember standing in my kitchen, the small one, the temporary one, reading the comments underneath strangers, debating my stability like it was a matter of public record. I didn't cry. I'd stopped expecting fairness from strangers a long time ago. What I felt instead was colder and more useful certainty that Ethan was no longer content to win quietly. The court ordered an independent psychological evaluation. I didn't fight it. Fighting it would have been read as fear, and I had not of that anyway. I sat through hours of questions with a psychologist who had no stake in either side, and I answered honestly the way I'd answer any debrief. Yes, I still thought about the men I couldn't save. Yes, sleep had been difficult in the years after certain deployments. No, none of it made me dangerous to my daughter. The evaluation cleared me completely. It stated plainly that I posed no risk and remained fully capable of caring for Emily. But Ethan's attorney didn't quote the conclusion. He quoted fragments, the sentence about sleep, the sentence about guilt stitched together out of context until they sounded like something they weren't. He submitted a photograph of me at a military memorial holding a ceremonial rifle during a moment of tribute, and tried to frame it as evidence of a woman fixated on violence. I sat in that hearing and let the photos circulate the room, and for one long moment I was back there, not in the courtroom but on a road outside a town whose name most Americans couldn't find, on a map, dust and smoke, and the particular silence that follows an explosion. I remembered going back into the kill zone for Ramirez, for Delacroix, for men whose faces I still see clearly enough to draw. I didn't run. I didn't leave until every one of them was out. That medal wasn't a trophy. It was a ledger of the ones I got to bring home, and a quieter accounting of the one I didn't. I let the memory pass through me the way I'd trained myself to without letting it show on my face, and I came back to the room in time to hear Ethan's attorney ask whether I'd processed that day fully. I answered him steadily. I didn't need to perform grief for a stranger to prove it was real. That evening, Emily showed up at my apartment without telling her father. She stood in the doorway looking older than 16, and the first thing she said was that Ethan had pressured her to write a statement saying she was afraid of me. She hadn't signed it. He told her she'd lose her college fund if she didn't. "He's already dragged me into it," she said when I told her I didn't want her caught in the middle of any of this. "You're the only one still pretending he didn't." I didn't have an answer for that. She was right, and some part of me had known it for weeks and hadn't wanted to see it. Then she handed me something small, a voice recorder she'd carried in her bag for weeks, the kind she used for a school project. She'd left it running by accident one afternoon in the back seat of Ethan's car. What it captured wasn't an accident at all. Ethan's voice, unmistakable, talking to his attorney. "Halpern knows what's expected. Once Ashley looks unstable, the house is ours." I sat very still listening to it twice then, a third time my daughter watching my face for a reaction I refused to give her. Not because I didn't feel it, because she needed to see that whatever her father had built, it wasn't strong enough to break me in front of her. Marcus verified the recording was unaltered, the audio clean, the timestamp intact. But a private conversation implicating Ethan wasn't the same as proof that Halpern himself was involved. It was close. It wasn't enough. "We could leak this to the right people," Marcus offered. "Force an early reaction." I told him no, not yet. In the Marines we learned that the man who fires first isn't always the man who wins. Sometimes you let the enemy walk deeper into ground of their own choosing. Let them grow confident. Let them commit resources they can't afford to lose. Ethan believed he was closing in on victory. I intended to let him believe that a while longer. I thanked Emily that night, in a way I hoped she understood, not with words, because words felt too small, but by promising her plainly that nothing happening in that courtroom was going to take her mother away. She hugged me at the door longer than she had in months, and when she left I sat alone with the recorder in my hand, thinking not about revenge, but about how much my daughter had already been forced to grow up. Marcus brought in a forensic accountant the week after Emily gave me that recording. Her name was Diane Okafor, a woman with the patient, unbothered energy of someone who'd spent 20 years finding what other people worked hard to hide. It took her 12 days to find the first thread. It took her 3 more to pull it all the way through. More than $600,000 had moved out of Ethan's company over the previous 18 months, routed through 3 shell corporations with names generic enough to mean nothing: Coastal Ventures Group, Highline Partners, Meridian Property Holdings. On paper, they looked like ordinary investment vehicles, but one of them shared a registered address with a law office belonging to Judge Halpern's brother-in-law. I remember Marcus reading that detail out loud and then setting the report down slowly, like he wanted to give the words room to land properly. A family trust connected to Halpern had invested in a resort development Ethan was building. None of it had been disclosed anywhere in the divorce filings, where financial transparency wasn't optional, it was required by law. Marcus wanted to file for Halpern's recusal immediately. I asked him to wait a little longer. If we moved too early with evidence that could still be explained away as coincidence, we'd hand Ethan and Halpern time to cover their tracks completely. I wanted something they couldn't spin, couldn't blame on bad bookkeeping or bad luck. So I sent a formal request for Ethan's complete financial disclosures, through the proper channel, through the court, nothing that would tip our hand. Ethan's response arrived 2 days later, and it wasn't what I expected. Instead of financial records, his attorney filed a motion asking the court to bar me from wearing my uniform or displaying my Navy Cross during any future hearings, arguing that my military presentation was designed to emotionally influence the proceedings. Marcus argued against it in writing. Halpern said he'd rule on it during the main hearing, which told me everything about which way he intended to lean. That same week, I was invited to a memorial service for a Marine I'd served with, a man named Corporal Danny Ruiz, who never made it home from his 3rd deployment. The memorial fell on the same morning as a scheduled hearing. I went to the service first in full dress uniform, Navy Cross pinned where it belonged, and I stood beside Danny's mother while a bugler played taps under a gray Virginia sky. I didn't rush through it. Some things you don't rush. I arrived at the courthouse afterward still in uniform because regulation required it for the occasion, not because I was making a point. Ethan's attorney seized on it anyway, telling the room I was using the military as a shield. I let the accusation sit in the air unanswered. Explaining myself to a room that had already decided what it wanted to believe wasn't a fight worth having yet. That evening, a name I didn't recognize called Marcus's office. A former employee of Ethan's company, someone who'd left under pressure 8 months earlier, and had been sitting on a folder of documents ever since, waiting apparently for a reason to use them. He brought receipts for a resort weekend charged to one of the shell accounts booked under Halpern's family name. He brought an email from Serena describing the charge in writing as a convenience fee. And he brought a call log showing repeated contact between Ethan, his attorney, and the judge's chambers, outside any official channel. Marcus laid it all across his desk that night, like a man assembling a case he'd waited years to build. He sent copies to the Judicial Oversight Commission the next morning and began drafting an emergency motion to halt the proceedings. We agreed not to tell Ethan. Not yet. Some ambushes only work if the other side walks in believing they're the ones setting the trap. I asked Emily to stay home for the next hearing, away from cameras, away from whatever noise might follow. She didn't argue. I think she understood better than I gave her credit for that something was about to change. The night before the hearing, Ethan called me. I almost didn't answer. When I did, his voice had a self-satisfied calm that told me he still believed he held every card at the table. "Tomorrow you're going to lose the house," he said. "Then the pension. Then Emily's finally going to understand who actually holds this family together." I let a beat of silence pass before I answered him because I wanted him to sit in it. "Tomorrow," I said, "she finally will." I hung up before he could respond. I sat alone in my apartment that night, the recorder Emily gave me on the table beside Diane's financial report and Marcus's motion, and I thought about every ambush I'd walked into and out of over 20 years of service. The rule was always the same. You let the enemy commit. You let them believe the ground beneath them is solid, and then you show them it never was. The courtroom was fuller than usual that morning, word having spread through the kind of small-town whisper network that turns a divorce into theater. People had heard about the unstable officer long before they knew anything true about me. Ethan sat beside his attorney with the composed posture of a man who believed he was one signature away from everything he wanted. Serena sat 2 rows behind him, close enough to watch her investment pay off. Though she had no formal reason to be there at all, Ethan's attorney rose first. He renewed the motion from the week before, arguing that my Navy Cross had no place in a family courtroom, that displaying it was a calculated attempt to sway the proceedings in my favor. Marcus stood to explain that I'd come directly from a memorial service that morning, that my uniform was regulation dress for the occasion, not a performance. Halpern listened to both arguments with an expression I'd come to recognize patient on the surface, already decided underneath. "Major Parker," he said, "remove the medal before this court continues." The room went still in that particular way rooms go still when everyone senses they're about to witness something they'll talk about later. I felt the weight of every eye in that gallery settle on me. For half a second I was back on that road again, dust and smoke, Ramirez's hand gripping my sleeve as I pulled him toward the vehicle. That memory didn't make me angry. It made me steady. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes he's finally found the lever that breaks someone. He thought this was the moment I lost whatever armor I had left. I reached up, unpinned the Navy Cross, and set it down on a folded handkerchief in front of me, careful and unhurried. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. Halpern nodded once, already moving to resume the hearing, already assuming the moment belonged to him. I turned instead to Marcus and gave him a single nod. He stood. What followed wasn't a plea or an objection. It was a motion for Halpern's immediate recusal from the case, supported by a sworn affidavit from Ethan's former employee. The completed forensic accounting report from Diane Okafor, verified emails and financial disclosures linking the shell accounts to Halpern's family trust, and formal notice that the Judicial Oversight Commission had already opened a preliminary inquiry into the judge's conduct. Halpern's face didn't change immediately, but his voice did, sharpening as he tried to dismiss the filing as procedurally improper, poorly timed, inappropriate for open court. Marcus, calm as ever, informed him that a copy of everything had already reached the Chief Judge's office, and that the Chief Judge was currently outside the courtroom reviewing whether to suspend the proceedings entirely. I asked to be heard briefly. Halpern hesitated, then allowed it, perhaps because stopping me at that point would have looked worse than letting me speak. "I didn't talk about the medal, I read dates. The date Ethan's company covered a resort trip for Halpern's family. The date Halpern denied my request for financial discovery without explanation. The date Ethan somehow knew about a hearing schedule that hadn't yet been made public. The date $600,000 moved into an account connected to the judge's relatives. Nobody in that courtroom made a sound. I watched the color drain slowly from Halpern's face as I read an email into the record, one line pulled directly from the documents Marcus had filed language, showing that once I was discredited, the property ruling was expected to be straightforward. Ethan turned to his attorney, his composure cracking for the first time since this had started, his mouth forming a question he clearly didn't want to ask out loud. Serena rose quietly, attempting to slip toward the exit, but a court officer stopped her at the door. A subpoena for her financial records had already been issued that morning. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened and the Chief Judge walked in. She suspended the proceedings on the spot and directed Judge Halpern to step down from the bench pending review. The room erupted into the kind of hushed, urgent murmuring that courtrooms aren't supposed to allow, and for a moment nobody seemed to know where to look, at Halpern, at Ethan, at me. I picked the Navy Cross up off the handkerchief, turned it once in my fingers, and didn't pin it back on. I didn't need it on my chest to remind anyone in that room who I was. I only needed the truth laid out in dates and numbers. A judge couldn't argue his way around to do that for me. Within a week, the case was reassigned to a different judge, in the same courthouse, a quiet, methodical woman named Judge Patricia N. Kemelu, who read every document in the file before she said a single word about it. Judge Halpern was suspended pending the outcome of the Judicial Oversight Commission's investigation, which moved faster than anyone expected once the financial records became public record. The findings were direct. He had failed to disclose a clear conflict of interest, maintained contact with one party outside official channels, and received indirect financial benefit through his family's trust. Rather than face the full disciplinary process, he resigned before it concluded. A 30-year judicial career ended not with a hearing, but with a letter. Ethan's attorney came under a separate ethics review for his role in coordinating with the judge's office. Serena, faced with the weight of what Diane's report had uncovered, chose to cooperate with prosecutors rather than risk the alternative. She handed over the remaining accounting records in exchange for reduced exposure, and the shell companies she'd helped build were frozen within days, their funds traced and flagged for return to the marital estate. The court's findings against Ethan were extensive. He'd concealed marital assets across 3 separate accounts. He'd submitted or encouraged the submission of misleading evidence regarding my mental fitness. He'd attempted to influence our daughter's testimony through financial pressure. And he'd used medical information about me, information I'd shared in confidence during treatment, for purposes far outside what any reasonable person would call fair use in a custody dispute. He requested a private settlement before the final ruling. I agreed to meet him once at Marcus's office with both attorneys present. He looked smaller across that conference table than I remembered him looking in 20 years of marriage. He told me he'd only done what he did because he was afraid of what would happen once I retired. Afraid of becoming irrelevant in his own house, afraid of losing whatever version of control he thought he still had. You weren't afraid of losing your family, I told him. You were afraid of not being able to control it. He didn't have an answer for that. He asked almost quietly if he could at least keep the house, said something about it being where Emily grew up, as if sentiment might undo what the financial records had already made plain. I reminded him he'd been planning to sell that house within months of the ruling to fund a joint venture with Serena on a resort project neither of them had ever mentioned to me. He didn't argue the point. There wasn't one left to make. Emily gave her testimony with the support of a child psychologist assigned to the case in a private session, away from the noise of the main courtroom. She was clear in a way that surprised even me, not angry, not performative, just honest. She told the court she wanted to live with me. She told them she no longer trusted her father to tell her the truth about anything, including about me. When the final ruling came down, Ethan lost primary use of the house, and most of the assets he'd tried to hide were ordered returned to the marital estate for equitable division. The court was careful, and Judge Nkamelu made a point of saying this plainly in her ruling, that Ethan wasn't being punished for infidelity. Affairs, however painful, weren't the court's business to punish. He was being held accountable for financial fraud, for manipulating evidence, and for the emotional harm inflicted on our daughter during the process. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I hadn't wanted revenge for a broken vow. I'd wanted accountability for everything that came after it. I kept the house. It had come from my father, purchased with the last gift he ever gave me, and the court recognized that lineage clearly enough that Ethan's claim to it dissolved, along with everything else he'd tried to build on top of it. His contact with Emily was reduced to supervised visits, at least until a court-appointed counselor determined otherwise. After the final session, he caught me in the hallway one more time, the same hallway where he'd once told me nobody cared who I used to be. "You destroyed my life," he said, and there was no performance left in his voice, nothing left to manage or control. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "No, Ethan," I said. "I just stopped protecting you from what you did." I walked past him without waiting to see his reaction. I'd spent 20 years learning that some retreats aren't surrenders. They're simply the moment you realize the fight is already over, and there's nothing left worth staying to prove. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. I didn't walk away with everything, no one ever really does, but I walked away with what mattered. The house stayed mine. My legitimate share of the assets was restored. I kept full custody of Emily with Ethan's visitation supervised until a counselor determined otherwise. And I got back something Ethan had spent almost 2 years trying to take from me quietly, piece by piece, my name spoken without suspicion attached to it. Ethan sold what remained of his stake in the company to cover legal fees and the financial obligations the court had ordered him to meet. He moved into a rental across town, the kind of place people describe as temporary, for far longer than they intend. Serena left the state entirely not long after her cooperation agreement was finalized, starting over somewhere none of us asked about. Judge Halpern's name became a quiet cautionary tale passed between attorneys in that courthouse, a reminder of what conflicts of interest cost when nobody catches them in time. I retired from the Marine Corps in a small ceremony at the base. Nothing extravagant, just the people who mattered standing in a modest room with flags along the wall. Emily was the one who pinned the Navy Cross back onto my dress uniform that day, her hands careful and a little unsteady the way mine had been the first time I held it. Afterward, she asked me something that had clearly been sitting with her for months. She wanted to know why I hadn't fought back the moment Halpern told me to take it off, why I'd just said, "Yes, Your Honor," and set it down without argument in front of a room full of people who assumed I'd finally been broken. Because honor was never in the medal, I told her. And nobody can take something from you that you never gave them the power to hold. I used part of what was restored to me to open the support center I'd been imagining for years, a place for military families navigating divorce, financial abuse, and the long, quiet aftermath of deployment that doesn't show up on any discharge paperwork. Every week I sit across from someone in the same position I was in 18 months ago, someone whose spouse has learned to use their service, their trauma, their silence as leverage. I don't tell them my story to prove I came out stronger than the man who tried to break me. Too many of us spend years protecting the people who hurt us, just to preserve the appearance of a family that was never whole to begin with. I tell them because somebody needs to say out loud that walking away from that isn't failure. It's the bravest decision some of us will ever make. The best revenge was never watching Ethan lose the house or the company or the reputation he cared about more than he ever cared about us. The real turning point came quietly on an ordinary evening months after the ruling, when I realized I no longer needed him to admit he was wrong. I didn't need his apology to know the truth of what happened in our marriage. I had already stopped waiting for permission to trust my own version of events. The day that judge told me to take off my Navy Cross, my husband believed he'd stripped away the last symbol of my strength in front of everyone who mattered. He never understood the simplest truth in the room. The medal never made me brave. My courage was what made me worthy of wearing it in the first place, and no courtroom, no husband, no man convinced of his own power was ever going to take that away from me. I still don't know how many of you have lived some version of this story, maybe not with a courtroom, maybe not with a medal, but with someone who tried to convince you that your strength was the thing standing in the way of your family. I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and if any part of Ashley's story felt familiar to you. We share stories like this every single day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking through these stories together.